During this webinar, we may speak about forward-facing features that are in pilot or beta. Please make all your implementation, purchasing, and investment decisions based on what we have available now. Now let's get started with today's session with our team, Intro to Command Lines and the Salesforce CLI.
Thank you so much, Karen. Hi, I am Peter Chittum, and I'm one of the developer evangelist team here at Salesforce. I'm super excited to bring this webinar to you today with my colleague, Karen Jameson.
Hi, my name is Karen Jameson. I'm the Director of Trailhead Content Engineering at Salesforce. I'm also the co-founder of Rad Women and blog at Women Code Heroes, and I am also very excited about this topic that I think is really helpful for both admins and developers.
All right, so today's agenda, we're going to do a little brief introduction, try and lay out the value proposition of command lines and why we think they are cool. And then we're going to show you some sort of general purpose command line features, things that we think can be useful for you just kind of in your everyday use of the command line. We'll go through a section where we will talk about the Salesforce command line itself, and then we'll end with some resources and hopefully some time for some Q&A, and of course, plenty of demos to go with that. And so this introduction here really is just to talk a little bit of background about ourselves and why we think you too can conquer the command line. So this is really focused at developers, any developer. If you have any experience developing on Salesforce, that's really the purpose of this presentation. We are going to talk about the Salesforce command line in some detail. So of course that is important, an important criteria. And then we're looking at people who haven't really adopted the command line as a tool yet. And a little bit of background about ourselves. I am a developer. That is one of the things about being a developer evangelist. I used command line interfaces years and years ago in the 80s and 90s. And then when GUIs came along, I kind of switched over and just started using them. About 5 years ago, though, I really started picking up command line interfaces again. And so I'd say I'm competent with command lines. And what I always say is that means I usually know how to find what I need to do on Google.
Yeah, and I'm an admin who codes. I'm also an engineering manager at Salesforce, which means I like to know a little bit about everything. And I love developer puzzles. I love when I have to Google something and look it up and then go down rabbit holes of what you can do with this stuff. And I use the CLI when I interact with GitHub because that's what we use for our source repository. So let's dive into some examples of how we could use the command line and what it is. So the first thing is, what is the command line? So as we know, everything on Wikipedia is true. So from this quote from Wikipedia, you can see that the command line interface is just a simple way of using text to interact with your operating system, the files on your computer, or as Peter's going to show you later, your Salesforce orgs. And this was found, and I think it's hilarious, by Peter, because it really speaks to what I first thought was like, I think that command lines are cool, but why? Why would I use them? When would I use them? So we're going to show you some examples of things that would be really helpful for you later on. But the great news is that you're probably already using the command line because it's built into everything that we use every day, things like your browser bar, address bar, or Slack. And I really love using Slack for things like adding things to polls and various other things. Peter, what about you? What do you like using it for?
Yeah, I use all of these really, but this is actually a really good example of me using one specifically. You can see this was actually a conversation between Kieran and myself last week where I was just reminding myself to make sure I booked some time with her so we could prep for this here webinar. How about you, Kieran? What did you use Slack for?
I use Slack all the time for a lot of things, just even simple things like mentioning someone. That is technically part of the command line. So you know, the good news is that you're already using commands, you just probably don't think about it that way. And there's other things that you can use command lines for. So for example, the one at the top is, it's actually not either of our emails, but here you can see that we're using the command line here to find any files that, or any mail that have an attachment that's unread and has particular keywords in the subject. I also use it a lot. I kind of use it as a way of running reports in GitHub, because I need to look at various pull requests. So there you can see some commands that are pulling out any open pull request that is in my org that isn't written in Ruby and isn't in, you know, various other redirects. So so yeah, so you're using it every day. But Peter, what is the benefit of using the CLI versus a GUI?
So I think this slide is meant to sum that up. And as you can see, it's meant to be kind of a compare and contrast of different attributes. And, you know, I think both GUIs and command lines have their place. I think they have their strengths, they have their weaknesses. And this is really meant to illustrate that, you know, and I'll be honest, this is not scientific. This was just Kieran and I putting some dots up on a slide that felt like the right thing. So feel free to disagree with this. But certainly you could say that GUIs, if they're written well, if they're built well, they're going to be intuitive and discoverable. You just have to park yourself in front of that thing and you will figure out how to use it. On the other hand, I think where command lines really come in is that they are super flexible. You're working a lot closer to the metal of the machine, if you will. You're directly interacting with the APIs that it's made available. And of course, all those great things you can do with command lines on creating batches, scheduling them. They tend to be speedy because there's no user interface, and just very quickly repeating tasks over and over again. That's really handy with command lines. And if you think about it, adopting any new technology is an adjustment. And this is one illustration of what that adjustment period could feel like, where you have some reason for adopting the technology. You then have some like really high expectations, and you go through this low point where you feel like you're never going to crack it, and then you kind of get to this. You eventually get to this plateau. And I'd say, in general, with command lines, I feel like I'm at that plateau now. Maybe I'm still closer to that slope of enlightenment with PowerShell, which is one of the things we're going to show you, one of the Windows shells. But with Bash and with Z shell, with the Unix-based shells, I feel really comfortable today. How about you, Kieran?
Yeah, I feel like I'm coming out of the trough of disillusionment. I really feel like CLIs are very cool, and I really want to make sure that I know how to use them, and I think that I've seen people use them in ways that is very efficient, and so I am trying to implement that in my daily life, and I think I'm up the slope of enlightenment, but I'm definitely not as far to the plateau as you are.
Nice one.
Yeah, so I guess the lesson is that it doesn't matter where you are on this, that it's a path. And sometimes I feel like that is, my daily life. I'm like, oh, I think I can do this. Oh, I don't know how to do this. Oh, look, I did it. So, there it is. So that's some background, but let's look at some actual examples. So the first thing that you need to know is that there is a basic workflow for what the command line is, and you have an input, either some kind of file or a standard input, and then you use that file or that input, and then you get some output out of it, either a standard out or standard error. So here you can see an example, and imagine you have this string of input called, and it's force.com, and you're running the sed command on it, which basically stands for stream editor. And what we use it for, and I'll talk about it in a bit, but what we use it for a lot is find and replace. And so what we're doing is we're finding any instance of force.com and we're replacing it with Lightning. So Lightning would be our output. So that's an example of the basic workflow of a command. So as you can see here, that there is a basic anatomy to the CLI command. You have a command that that you use, and then you can apply some parameters or options to it. And those options can either be verbose, like the one on top, which is --UTC, which stands for convert this date to universal timecode. Or we often see that there's abbreviations like dash lowercase u. And note that the parameters are case sensitive, so you want to pay attention to which case you're supposed to use. I've definitely had that bite me in the past. And also just a note that when what you're seeing here is bash, which is used on Macs, Unix, and Linux, but the same principles apply if you're on a PC and either using the command shell in Windows or PowerShell. So we're going to talk through some of the 5 top commands that you'll use pretty much all the time when you're working in the command line. And then we're going to use them in a demo as well. So one of the first things you'll learn using the command line is how to move around your file system. So on the left, you'll see a set of examples that will work through all of the work with all of the Unix-based systems like Macs. On the Mac side of things, but on the PC side of things, we have equivalents. I'm going to be when we see a demo, I'm going to be demoing on a Mac with Bash, and then Peter's going to be demoing with PowerShell, or actually I think within the VS Code, actually I think. But we have the equivalents, and as the name would, with PowerShell, it's a really good command line interface tool to use because it sets up a whole bunch of stuff for you. So it's really good. And on the Mac side of things, we're going to be using Z Shell, which is another sort of thing that you lay on top of the CLI. So, but on the PC side of things, you're going to see instead of CD, the full name in PowerShell is set-location. But again, we have an alias. So PowerShell sets up these aliases. So if you're used to using CD, you can just use CD. But you can see there that it's almost exactly the same in PowerShell as it is in Unix. There's one difference in that in Macs, and Unix-based machines, you're going to use a /, but in a PowerShell and PC, you're going to use a \. So another set of commands that you use a lot shows you what the contents of the directory are in. So in Unix-based machines, we use ls, and a common combination of the parameters for this is -AL, which stands for show me all the files, that's the A, and then including the hidden files, and then show me it in a detailed or long format, that's the L. The equivalent for PC is get-child item, but again, you can use these aliases ls or dir, and the attributes are a little different. Sorry, the parameters are a little different on PowerShell as well. You can see an example. Now let's output some text from a file. So we can use cat, head, and tail on a Mac. So cat stands for concatenate, which might seem a little strange when we're just outputting a file, but I think about it this way. If you're concatenating a file with nothing, then you get the contents of just that file. So that's exactly what you're going to see in this first example. The second example shows concatenating 2 files together and outputting them on your screen. The next line using head is outputting the top 5 lines of your text file. And so that's the -n says how many rows do you want to see, or how many lines. And again, you can use it with tail as well. So that's the bottom, the last 5 lines. So in both head and tail, the -n, as you can see there, defines how many lines you want to output. And on a PC, you'd use get-content with an alias of cat or gc. And to add the contents of 2 files together, you can use something that's pretty cool that is available on PowerShell but isn't on Unix, and that is you can actually create variables. So here you see file 2, we're creating a variable, we're getting the contents of file 2, and then we're going to use @content to concatenate the file 1 text to the variable, which is the contents of our file 2. And you can do the same thing with head and tail. There you're just defining the path, so that minus path is the path of the file that you want to create, and then it's minus head or minus tail and then a number. So finding text within a file is pretty easy with the CLI. On Unix-based machines, we're going to use a command called grep, which stands for Global Regular Expression Print. So in the first example, we're looking at for any instance of Cody in the file that is character.txt, so that's the file that we're looking at. And in the second example, we're using a parameter, a -r, so that we can use a regular expression. And so in this case, we're looking for examples of the defunct test method within our classes directory. And on the right, you can see the same thing formatted in a different way, but it's basically the same functions that we're doing there, but using SLS as the alias. So what about finding and replacing? We saw this example earlier in our first example of what a command might look like. And we use sed. Now, sed is a very powerful command, and you can use it for quite a few things, but the most common thing that you could use it for is to substitute, which is the S, or find and replace text. So the S that you see there, after the first single quote, stands for substitute. And so that's what we're saying. We're saying stream editor, we want to substitute, and we want to substitute this and substitute it for that. And then we tell it which file to go into. By default, sed only finds for the first instance of that string in per line. So if you have multiple instances of this in a single line, that first example would only replace the first line, and we're going to the first instance in the line, and we're going to see that in a sec. But if you want to find all instances of this and replace it with that, then you would use the G option, which stands for global. And then if you want to make sure that what you're searching for is case insensitive, then you use the capital I. And you can see on the right, there's PowerShell. It's a little more complicated in PowerShell. And we're using the minus, there's two different ways you can do it, and I've shown two different examples there. I think the simplest one is the second one, which is where you use GC, which is get content. So you're getting the content from the file.txt file, and then you're replacing this with that. So I think for me, that's the most intuitive, but you decide when you're using it. So there's all manner of command lines, and this is not, by no stretch is it all of them, but here are some ones that you're going to use most often. You can look at this at your leisure afterwards when we share the slides. So this is for the Bash family, so Mac, Linux, and Unix, and the same thing for PowerShell on a Windows machine. So commands by themselves are really powerful, but they're even more powerful when you string them together. So we use the semicolon to string commands together. So what this is basically saying is first do the thing on the left and then do the thing on the right. So for example, go to my root directory and then list the contents of it. Using the pipe symbol sends the output of one stream to the next stream. So for example, if we have a really large file and we want to be able to output and just sort of scroll through it, then we first might cat it and send that output of that cat, so sending the contents of that big file.txt to a command called less, which is going to show you just a bit of it, and then you're going to press enter and it'll just slowly go down through it. I will note that if you use this and it's a really long file and you want to get out of it, then you type Q to exit. So the next operator that we use a lot is the greater than sign. And this redirects the output from whatever's on the left-hand side and outputs to a file. Note that you have to be really careful with this, because if the file already exists, you're going to replace using this for just one greater than style, you're going to replace the contents of that file. So you just want to be careful to make sure that that's exactly what you want to do. If the file doesn't exist, then it will just create it. So it's actually a good way of, one of the good ways of creating a file easily. So in this example, we're showing a new command called echo, and it basically just outputs text. And it can be helpful in a lot of ways, but in this case, all we're doing is putting the text, or the string text1, and we're putting it into the myfile.txt file. So if that file again doesn't exist, then this will create it. If it does exist, then it will replace what's in it with text1. So if you don't want to replace the content, but rather you just want to append something to the end of an existing file, then you use 2 greater than signs. So this stands for append. And so in this case, if we take the previous slide and we do this command, echo text2, and append it to myfile.txt, then what we're going to get is we're going to get one line that says text1 and the other line that says text2. So here you can see all of these important operators that we've just talked about. Some other key features of command line that make it easier to use is that if you hit your tab key, then it will auto-complete. If there's only one command or text file, or whatever you're using that starts with that particular string that you put in, then it will auto-complete whatever you've started typing. Control C, and it's control even if you're on a Mac, will stop a process from running. So if you type something and you forget a quote or something and your command line is just hanging, it's just doing stuff and it's never going to stop, then Control C is the way to stop it. And then you can use your up and down arrows to move through your history of your typed commands. So that's another great shortcut to use. And there's lots of other keyboard shortcuts, but those are the most common. So here we've put together some recipes to give you an example of what you might be able to do. So the first one is show all the files, including hidden files, in a directory, and then save that list of files to a files.txt file. The second one gets you to your home directory, and then it prints out what the location is. So that's the file path. The next one looks for the word old in file.csv, and then we're going to replace old with new and then redirect that those results into a new file called cleaned.csv. The next one looks a little overwhelming, but basically it's using a regular expression. We didn't make this up, we found it on the internet, but basically what it's doing is it's going to go through a file and it's going to look for any email addresses. So we have a whole bunch of commands there, and then you can see that there's an at symbol right here. So this is looking for the at symbol, and then it's looking for a whole bunch more letters and numbers, and there's a few other things that you can include in a email address, and then it's looking for the dot, and then it's looking for 2 to 6 other characters that form the last part of the domain. So again, you can use regular expressions. I'm not a guru of regular expressions, but there are a ton of resources out there on the internet to help you come up with whatever the regular expression is that you need. And then the last one here, it's getting the first line of file 1, and it's concatenating it to the top of file 2, and then creating a new file called file 3. So that is a lot of talking. How about some actual showing? So what we're going to do is we're going to take the command line for a spin, and we're going to use a bunch of these most common commands. And in the meantime, just for fun, we're going to play around with the forward-looking statement, because as we probably all know, it's kind of fun to play around with the forward-looking statement. So here I have my command prompt, and I'm actually using Z Shell, which you can install over the top of your terminal window. And here I have, well, let's just see where I am. So I'm at CD. I want to be in my root directory. my home directory, and I'm just going to do cd tilde. So I'm going to make sure that I'm there. Then I'm going to go into another directory. So I know that the directory starts with CL, but I don't want to type the rest of it. So I'm just going to hit my tab, and it's going to find the only directory that has CLI in it. And then I know that I have a demo in here, but I'm not sure which one. I don't remember exactly. There's probably more than one demo directory, and there is. So I'm just going to go into demo 1. I'm hitting my tab. And press enter. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to list the list the files that are in this directory, ls. So you can see that there's 2 directories here, and this matches here. So as I create and delete files using the CLI, you can see the results of this in my Finder window over here. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to echo, which means output, text1, and I'm going to redirect that to a new file called mytext.txt. So here, oops, I did something wrong, but that's okay. It still created it. Oh, because I spelt it wrong, but it still did it. That's interesting. So let me do that again and spell it correctly. There we go. So if I cat this directory, this file, then you can see it's got in it text1. So now what I want to do is I want to append something to it. So I'm going to append text2 to my text text file, and then I'm going to once again cat so that I can output it, and there you can see it's text1, text2. And if I do ls for listing the files, you can see here this is my new file, and you can see it over here as well. I'm going to do something now, clear, which is nice because if you've done a bunch of commands and you just want a clean slate, clear just bumps everything up and it gives you a clear slate. So the next thing I want to do is I want to play around with the forward-looking statement. So I have here a forward-looking statement file. I'm just going to cat it and press enter, and then you can see here that this is the forward-looking statement. But what if I use cat for looking at how many lines are in this forward-looking statement? So I'm going to cat again, but I'm going to pipe the results of that cat to the command WC, which stands for word count, minus L looks for how many lines there are. So there are 54 lines in this. What if I was looking for the how many words were in this? And I do a minus M for that, and that's how many, actually I think that's how many characters. I'd have to look at my reference. I think it's characters, how many characters are in that. So I'm going to clear that again. And again, this is all just in memory. I haven't actually saved anything. It's all just happening in memory. But let's look at what it would look like if I actually did a concatenation. So I'm going to concatenate 2 versions of the forward-looking statement. And you can see as I scroll up, here's the end of one forward-looking statement and here's the beginning of the other. So that's pretty cool. So what else can we do with the forward-looking statement? Let's find a word that's pretty common in the forward-looking statement, and that is statement. So I'm going to grep statement, and I'm going to tell it which file to look at. So it's looking for the string statement in the forward-looking statement. And when I output that, you can see that it has found all of the times that statement is used within that. Now, I'd like to replace statement with something different because I like to play around with the forward-looking statement. Peter, what should I replace it with?
I think we should replace it with Cody.
Okay, so let's grep for statement, and then I'm going to pipe that, so pipe the results into another command, the sed command, and we talked about this before. So sed, we're going to say we want to substitute statement for Cody, spelling it right. How do you spell Cody? Cody? I can't remember. I should know that.
It's an EY, I believe.
UI?
EY.
EY. That looks better. I knew it looked bad.
Yeah.
So I'm going to find and replace statement with Cody, and then I'm going to then output that just in my terminal window, I'm not going to save the file, but I'm going to grep for Cody. What did I do wrong? Grep statement, forward-looking statement said Cody, grep Cody.
Double quotes on the end of your, oh no, you didn't use quotes there, did you?
Well, let's try. See, this is the fun part of a live demo. You can see.
Oh, you need the slash at the end after Cody.
Ah, perfect.
That's what it is.
There it is. Yay!
There you go.
See, this is troubleshooting in action.
Teamwork.
And this is why I'm just on the beginning of the slope for Learning CLI. So you can see here that it's replaced the word statement for Cody, but I see that there's a problem. And it's that this word here, this statement, did not get replaced, and that's because, as I said before, it's looking at this line and it's just replacing the first one. So let's go in and tell it to do a global replace. So I'm just going to put a G here, and now you can see that it's replacing all of the versions of Cody. So that's pretty cool. What else can I do? So what I want to do now is I want to look at the first 5 lines of the forward-looking statement. So for that, I'm going to use head -n says I want to look at, how many rows do I want to look at? So I'm going to say 5, and then I'm telling it which file I want to look at. So here's the first 5 lines of my forward-looking statement. And if I wanted to look at the tail, so the last 5 lines, then I would just use tail -n 5, and then again, forward-looking statement. So that's great. What if I wanted to take the head? What if I wanted to squish the top? I want to make a shorter version of the forward-looking statement. I want to take the top 5 lines and squish it with the last 5 lines and just forget everything else that's in the middle, because I don't want to read all of that. So I'm going to redirect the first 5 lines into a file called shorter.txt. And as I do that, you can see over to the right here that shorter was created, but let's show what that would look like in the CLI. So here I am catting shorter.txt. So there's my file. It just has these 5 lines in it. And now I want to add the last lines to this. So I'm going to use the tail -n 5 forward-looking statement, because I want to take the last 5 lines, and I'm going to append it to my shorter.txt. And you can't really see that, so I'm going to cat the shorter.txt so you can see the output there. So there we have the first 5 lines and the last 5 lines squished together in one file. But I'm pretty sure Legal would have a conniption if I kept this. So I'm going to now remove it. So removing a file is pretty easy. rm shorter.txt, and I've removed it. You can see it's gone here, but let's confirm it in our command line ls. There is no shorter.txt. So that is a whirlwind short version of what it looks like to work with the CLI in with basic commands. But there's a lot more you can do with this, and I'm going to pass this over to Peter to show you more information about how you can use the CLI with your Salesforce orgs.
Great, thanks very much, Karen. I love a lot of those operations, and I use them every day these days. Hopefully, when we get to some of the Salesforce CLI stuff, you can also see how we use some of those features, albeit I will be showing them in PowerShell, so they'll look slightly different. But there's a lot of what you can do in the in Bash that has an analog version in PowerShell if that's the command line that you have access to. So we're going to talk about Salesforce DX because that's the umbrella where the Salesforce command line lives. This is, of course, our set of new modern software development tools that we've been building for the last 3+ years and making available to you, our developers. Now, one of the things that I often get when I talk to developers about using the command line is this statement here that says, I'd use the Salesforce command line, I'd use the command line, but we don't use Salesforce DX. And I just want to take a moment and do some objection handling of that particular statement globally to state that Salesforce DX is everything about what we're doing for developer experience right now. So in fact, that's what the DX stands for, is developer experience. And if you are writing Apex, if you're building the user interface using Lightning components or Lightning Web components, if you are doing project lifecycle management or application lifecycle management, building sandboxes, tearing them down again, using scratch or its packages. So everything from the things that maybe we introduced when we came up with this umbrella term, those are part of Salesforce DX. But a lot of the things that we used to do as developers, we've now put those in the Salesforce DX umbrella as well. So guess what? If you're a Salesforce developer, you are using Salesforce DX. And I think that one of the most underutilized tools for folks who haven't adopted some of those newer tools is the command line. The reality is the whole Salesforce DX suite of features and APIs and functionality, that stuff is really, it's not a fixed menu. It is a buffet. In other words, you can go and pick and choose the bits and pieces that make the most sense to you to use in your building of applications on the Lightning platform. And just to reiterate and to underscore this, it is actually called the Salesforce CLI. If you look at the documentation, it is the Salesforce CLI command reference. And the way that I think of this is that this is the tool to connect my laptop to any org that I want to. It gives me access to the Salesforce APIs. It's essentially a client application that's a command line. Those APIs are the REST API, bulk API, tooling API, metadata API. So there's a number of features and functionality that you can take advantage of using the Salesforce CLI. Now, this is a universal command line, so you can use it on Windows or Mac. Either one, doesn't matter. I do this demo in both operating systems. And it is pluggable. In other words, you can add new plugins. There are a host of community-built plugins that are available, and they're growing every day. And if you have some specific feature that you need to take advantage of or some way that you are accessing an API, there's no reason you can't create your own plugin. When we post the slides, there's a link here. Shane McLaughlin is a member of the platform demo team. He has built a directory in GitHub of basically anybody who's built a custom plugin for the CLI can post the link to their plugin in that directory. So I'd go check that out. There's some really cool stuff around like data management, populating sandboxes with data, that sort of thing. And that's it. I'm going to jump right into my demo because I want to spend as much time showing you using the command line as possible. Now, if you're familiar with Visual Studio Code, you'll notice that that's actually where I'm at right now. I'm in Visual Studio Code, but how am I accessing my console? Because that's actually what this thing is right here. Visual Studio Code can launch a terminal window, and a terminal is sort of the same term that we use for like a console or a command line. You can run the command line of your choice or the shell of your choice. You can actually use the old command line, the DOS-based command line. You can use PowerShell, which is what I'm doing. That's what that little PS at the beginning of the line is. Or you can use Windows Subsystem for Linux, which is basically a bash distribution that you can run on Windows these days. Now I'm trying to go all native as I go back into using Windows a little bit. So that's kind of why I went the direction of PowerShell. I don't really like the old DOS command line. I like a lot of the things that PowerShell gives me as far as the features and functionality. And PowerShell also allows you to directly invoke .NET library. So if there's something it doesn't do and somebody's written a library for it, you can just go and do that. You can invoke it right directly from the command line. So cool. Let's jump right in. So we're here to talk about the Salesforce command line, which is SFDX. And as you see when I invoke this, this is actually the core engine behind the Salesforce command line. And these commands here are all the plugins that come as standard when you install the BOG standard Salesforce command line. The Force plugin is where you'll find all the stuff that connects to your org. So if I do SFDX Force, it's kind of cool. I get a cloud. All right, that's actually not really going to help me doing development, but I think it looks kind of cool. Who doesn't love ASCII art, right? And very useful actually is a bunch of links to the documentation that you can actually click through depending on your shell that you're using. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But here, clearly, if I want to get to the Salesforce command line reference, I can just click right on that and it'll take me to my browser of choice and it'll show me that. Pretty cool. All right, so what else do we want to do? Well, of course, I want to show you how to use the commands of the command line first and foremost. And there's a lot of stuff you can do around discoverability. If you do SFDX Force with a question, sorry, with a -H rather, not a question mark, you can actually see all the different topics that are available under the Force plugin. But if I do SFDX Force, I'm just going to skip to the end here and do doc commands list. I can actually see every single command. That's interesting. SFDX Force doc. Oop. That would be helpful. And this is actually a nice feature of the command line that I stumbled across. I'm just too slow to do it. You notice here it gave me the option of doing the correct command because I totally fat fingered it. But there we go. So force doc commands list, and there they all are. So that's really handy, but it could be that maybe I just want to see all the ones that are related to working with orgs, for instance. What I could do then, and this is where that piping and using, if I was on Bash, I'd be using grep, but instead I'm going to use select string, which has an alias of SLS, and look for the word org. And what you'll see is it's going to basically filter stuff out. Unfortunately, it says the word org in a lot of the descriptions over here, but I can at least see that it's a little bit of a subset of the list. I can see all the org commands right here. And understand what can I do to work with my org, which is actually a good next place to go. So if I want to find out what are the orgs I've currently authorized with, that's SFDX Force org list, and off it goes. Now this actually can take some time. If you have more than a few orgs that you've authorized, what it's going to do is go and double check the OAuth refresh token that has been stored locally in a secure data store on your hard drive still works to connect to that org. So if you have 20 orgs, it needs to check all 20 of those orgs before it comes back and it reports back. So it can take a little bit of time. When I run this on my Mac, I do have something like 20 orgs, and I go get a cup of coffee and come back. Maybe not quite that bad, but it takes a little bit of time. Now, you can see here that I've got a sandbox, I've also got a production org, and I have a scratch org down below here. I'll probably use that scratch org a little bit later. But for now, I want to check, let's say that, I just want to get a status. What's the state of the limits of the API calls on my org? The command to do that is SFDX Force API limits, limits API display. Getting the order there is somewhat useful. And it's going to go and it's going to query the limits of that org, and it's going to come and report back. Now, of course, there are a lot of limits in the org, and I'm just interested in the API limits. So again, I can use that trick of filtering down those results. And I can use SLS or again grep if I'm in Bash, and I can go and look for the word API. And it comes back, and there we go. So now I can see, actually, I haven't really used this org very much. I've got plenty of API requests. I've got, I'm not really using much. But if I did need to check the status, you can see it's very easy for me to connect to that and to find out. Now, as I had talked about the org one already, I did force org list. What else is available for force org? One thing that you can do is sfdx force org. When you're at a sub topic, you can drop the -h in there, and more often than not, it'll show you all of the different sub commands in that list. So I can see that for orgs, I can go and create orgs and clone orgs. So if you're wondering what create and clone are all about, well, those are about sandboxes and scratch orgs. Specifically, create works with either a scratch org or a sandbox, and clone is a new feature we've added to sandboxes where you can build a sandbox that, let's call it your prototype sandbox, and then you can just clone that sandbox over and over when you need to farm off an org for your developers to work in. So if you haven't adopted scratch orgs and package-based projects yet, you now can use the Salesforce command line to very easily provision those sandboxes. So let's go take a look at how we can do that. Now, one of the things that's really interesting, if you recall when I did my force org list, there was only one box out there. Now, there are actually currently more sandboxes available in that org. It's just I've not authorized them locally. So an interesting thing that you can do is you can actually do force org sockle query -t for the tooling API, and then you can go and say, why don't you go and show me select sandbox name, license type from sandbox info, and that should do it. But I do need to tell it which org. That's my prod org. So what are all of the sandboxes? Force org sockle query. Oh, force data sockle query. That would be useful. Let's try that again. All right, that'll be helpful. So what are all the sandboxes available? You can see that actually I have that SUM19 SBX1. That's actually the one that I've authorized to. But I actually want to clone a Lightning Dev sandbox. This is actually the new Lightning Developer Pro sandbox. So I'm going to go and do that. So that LTNG SBX1, that's the one I'm going to clone. So sfdx force org clone is the command. And then once I do that, I need to tell it some information. First of all, the clone does require you to specify the type of org as sandbox. Currently, that's the only option. But I'm guessing that that might be used for something else in the future. That's just me, pure conjecture on the part of Peter, not even a forward-looking statement. -u prod, that's the org that the sandbox is stored in. -u is oftentimes the name of the user you're going to connect to Salesforce with. And then what is the source sandbox name? So source sandbox name equals LTNG SBX1. What is the sandbox name? So for my new sandbox, I already have SBX1 and 6, so I'm going to do sandbox name equals 2. And then I'm going to finally say, go ahead and wait 20 minutes. It shouldn't take more than about 5 or 10 minutes for cloning an org, but I'll give it a little bit of extra time, and I'll kick that off. Now, so that's all well and good. Now I just have to wait for that. Of course, we're not going to do that. We might come back and see if it's done later, but let's go look at one last thing, which is how can you be a little bit more productive with your Apex code? So what I'm going to do is do Control-Shift+, and oh, that's right, this wasn't working as a, oh, there we go, yeah. Cool, so let me do Control- because that's also changing the font size and switch that up. All right, so this is the same as clicking on this plus button here, which essentially opens a new terminal. So I'm going to go here and clear that. All right. So what I'm going to do is go to projects, and then I'm going to go to the this recursive trigger project. So I've created a project. If I do this, and I love this command. It's called tree. Isn't that cool? Just kind of shows you what the tree of files are. So this is a Salesforce project, and I designed this project specifically to throw an Apex error. So if I do sfdx force Apex execute, that's going to execute anonymous, and that file is in Apex /test1.cls. So what we're going to see is we get an error, and it's going to be pretty obvious what the error is. I basically created a recursive trigger. If you look really carefully where it says maximum trigger depth exceeded, we know what that is, right? Trigger is causing a trigger is causing a trigger is causing a trigger. So, but what if this was a more difficult error to chase down, and I was in the midst of development? I didn't want to go and start a whole debug session yet. One thing I could do is this: sfdx force Apex log tail. And when I do that, what's going to happen is it's actually going to open up the debug log and output it. And if I do -C, it'll actually color certain log lines. So I'll fire that off. I'll go back to where that would help if I passed a username. -u prop. No, -u. Yeah. Oh, I know what I do. I need to get to the right directory. How come? So let's go there again. CD projects and recursive trigger. All right. So let's do that one more time. So this project is set up with a default scratch org. So I don't need to explicitly specify the user. All right. So that's off and running. If I go back to that's my sandbox. There's that. So if I go back to this one and rerun my Apex test, let's see what's going to happen. The debug log should come out, and then what I can do is I can kind of scroll through. The -C highlights certain lines that have problems with them. Now, of course, this is like a lot of stuff to dig through still. So what if I want to narrow it down even further? Let's take this one step further. And what we're going to do is go back here. That one's good. All right. So I'm going to Control-C out of this. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to say do the tail, but I actually want to, I'm going to write that to debug log1.log. So when I run this, instead of outputting it to the console, it's going to output it to the file. So I've redirected it to the file just like Kieran showed you. Now we're going to go one level deeper. Once again, I'll go to my directory. And it's lagging a little bit. My poor machine, I think I bogged it down with too much. Let's see if we can get through this. Wow, okay, this was not this slow last time I ran this. Probably everything going on all at once. Okay, all right, good. So now I'm gonna say, so GC is the alias for get content. I'm gonna get content in the debug log. Ooh, totally lagging. There we go, log1.log. Now I can do something like this as well with bash, and the way that I would do that is with the grep command that that we saw earlier. So this would be like grepping my, I'm sorry, this would be with the tail command where I can leave the tail open. So I'm going to do -wait, and then I'm going to pipe it to where. And hopefully the buffer catches up with me. I think one thing I might do to maybe save myself some resources is kill this other Visual Studio Code window. Okay, that seems to be a little bit better. And in PowerShell, you sort of have to say, okay, so for each output line, and that's the $_ variable. You can say where that $_ variable matches, and then some expression. So we'll say exception. Okay.
I feel like this is the little engine that could.
I know, my poor little, Surface Pro 5 is really, really trying hard. Okay, so we'll take a crack at that and see how that works. But this should work, and then I can execute one last time. All right, that's going. We'll go up to there. We'll re-execute the test, and then with any luck, we'll see where Peter was going with this, which is basically what I'm trying to do is take all of those like hundreds of log lines and just output the ones that I care about. So you could do this with exception, you could do it with the word debug, you could do it with the word error. If you wanted to see where all your variables were being declared, you could match on that. Doing this doing this with a grep in Bash is even more powerful because you can sort of do an extended match and match like multiple things at once. All right, so that is still lagging. Oh, there we go. I think I found the limits of my poor Surface. Oh, there we go. Yes, it worked finally. So there we go. So I have, it was hundreds of lines before, and I filtered that down to just a few lines that actually tell me what I want. And doing this with like an exception filter, I think is really handy because you'll actually get right to the exception. Obviously doing it on a Surface Pro 4 while doing a presentation at the same time and doing a webinar, maybe that's a little bit of a stretch, but we made it. All right.
Well done.
So quickly going back through here, these last few slides are basically going through the things I talked about already. There's some recipes, and then that brings us to our resources. So basically, anyone can use the command line. If you want to get productive with the command line, find a good reason to use it, find an excuse, and just use it every day a little bit, and it will come. And finally, the Salesforce command line is a great thing for developer productivity, whether you're using Scratch orgs or not, whether you're doing continuous integration or not, whether you're doing point and click because you can sync your changes down to your directory or not, you can still use the command line for everyday developer work. We do have some Trailhead resources here, so check out the app development with Salesforce DX, the Git and GitHub basics, and there is a Salesforce DX quick start as well. We have a few resources here for you to check out when you're done, so be sure to take a look at those. And with that, I don't know, do we have any time for Q&A? We're right up against the top of the hour.
Yes, we actually have a couple of questions. And I know we are short on time, but I will just go ahead and rattle a couple of these off. So the first question that we have is, does the data bulk upsert SFDX CLI command use bulk API 2.0?
So I saw that question come in really early on the webinar, and I did some poking. Let me see if I got any responses. I don't have anything definitive from the folks in product teams that I reached out to. The response is that people don't think so, but it isn't something that that anybody who I was able to reach knew for sure right away. But we can definitely, we can try and answer that after the fact.
Okay, and then the last question is, can you talk more about what an alias is?
Yeah, sure. So, well, there's actually 3 different kinds of aliases that we saw today. So first of all, an alias for your org Normally when you use the command line to authorize an org, what's going to happen is it will just give you the username. If it's a regular org username, that might not be so bad, but scratch org usernames, or if you're using a Trailhead playground, those can be extremely long usernames and not exactly very friendly to remember. An alias allows you to wrap that up into a pointer. Basically, it's sort of a nickname for that org that is just for your own personal laptop, so it just needs to be unique in your installed version of the Salesforce command line. And then you can use that to connect to the org with the -u parameter. And just to go back and show that really quickly, if I go back to this one here, I'm going to go back up. So on this command here, where I did force org clone, that -u prod, that prod there, that is an alias. Okay. There are aliases also in generic Bash and in PowerShell. Each one works slightly differently. A PowerShell alias is basically a substitute for just the command. But Bash aliases, you can actually wrap a whole lot of stuff into it and then add stuff on the end. And then when you invoke that, Bash will expand that, execute the whole thing. And then if it works, then you've basically given yourself a shortcut for a really complex command potentially.
Great, thank you. Thank you all for your questions, and to all of our panelists for answering them and for today's presentation and demo. So be sure to check out the resources outlined today if you'd like to find out more about command lines and the Salesforce CLI. And then just a quick reminder to please share your feedback with us so we can make our future webinars even better. You'll see a pop-up for a survey at the end of the webinar. Also, you'll be able to access this video in 48 hours from the registration page where you signed up. And that concludes today's webinar. Thank you everyone for joining us today. We hope to see you again soon. Enjoy the rest of your day.